The northbound train screeched into the Silver Basin station just past noon, blowing a thin veil of snow off the platform. Travelers hurried down the steps, jackets pulled tight against the December wind. Beta Langford stepped onto the wooden planks with her satchel hugged close, her breath drifting pale into the frosty air. She hardly noticed the bustle around her. Her nose was still buried in a folder of livestock reports, notice, on milk yield variations, feed ratios, behavioral charts. The institute had sent her west for a winter study on ranching conditions. It was an honor, a challenge, and if she were honest, a welcome escape from the stifling offices back east. A pair of wagons waited near the loading area. One, painted a polite forest green, held a man in spectacles wearing an institute badge. He stood tall, scanning the passengers for her. The other wagon, a rougher thing with patched canvas. A few cedar branches tied to the rails blocked her view of him. Its driver, a rangy ranch hand, shouted over the crowd, "Gil's bride. Lit her bride for Gil. Iron horse wagon for the Iron Horse place." Beta, still reading her notes, heard only. "Institute research your stops this way, miss," which the ranch hand did not say at all. But in her mind, the words aligned neatly with what she expected to hear. She stepped forward. "I'm with the livestock study," she said without looking up. The ranch hand blinked. "Sure, that's her then," he muttered, assuming she was indeed the mail order bride. Before anyone corrected anything, he grabbed her trunk and loaded it onto the wagon. Beta climbed aboard, still flipping through pages. "I wasn't expecting the institute to use a ranch wagon, but I suppose it's practical." The ranch hand frowned, but clicked the rest. "Discover more. TV and video. History. Fruits." Before she could puzzle it out. The wagon jolted away from the station, leaving the man with spectacles, still waiting patiently beside the green wagon. Wondering why his passenger never arrived. The ride took nearly an hour. Snowflakes blew sideways across the open basin, catching on Vera's coat and settling like white dust on her hair. She finally looked up when the wheels rolled through a narrow valley of sagebrush and cottonwood. A corral appeared first, then a lone pole barn, several pens, and a few rows of winter vegetables clinging stubbornly to life beneath canvas covers. Her eyebrows lifted. A field office this far out. The institute must really have expanded. The ranch hand hopped down. "Iron Horse place. Es inside." "Iron Horse," she murmured. "Is that what they're calling the West Station now?" "Well, creative, I suppose." No sign bore the institute's emblem. No clerk bustled about. Instead, livestock wandered in and out of open sheds, and a thin plume of smoke curled from a chimney. Vera smoothed her gloves, marched to the door, and knocked twice. She expected a familiar voice. Professor Denton, her mentor of 5 years. She even began the greeting she'd rehearsed during the train ride. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm Das." The door swung open and she froze. Standing in the doorway was not her mentor, not an institute colleague. Not even a man she recognized. It was a patchy tall, broad across the shoulders, dark-keyed in a way that suggested more sleepless nights than he would ever admit. His long hair was tied back with a leather cord. Snow clung to the edges of his coat as if he had just come from checking the herd. But it was the urgency in his face that struck her, the taut line of his jaw, the slight tremor in his breath, like a monkey bracing for a blow. "You're the bride," he said. Beta blinked hard. "The what?" "The bride I wrote to." "You came on the noon train." A stepped aside briskly. "We don't have time." Coming, she lifted a hand, trying to slow the rush of confidant. "I think there's been a," he cut her off with a shake of his head. "They'll be here any minute. You need to change into something tidy and pack your things so we can look like we've settled them." "Harry." "Harry for what?" she demanded, trying to plant her heels. "Sir, I believe you are entirely mistaken." His brows pressed together. "Didn't I say everything in the letters? You're my bride. We have to show them. It's the only way they'll leave my land alone." He motioned her urgently toward a small hallway. "Please." "What letters?" She sputtered. "I don't even know your name." Stared at her as if she'd gone clean mad. Heel. Heel iron horse. And right now is not the moment for this argument. Before she could protest further, sharp knocking rattled the door behind him. Heel's face blanched. He whispered harshly, "Please, if you walk out now, they'll take my land. Used for today, help me." For today? Cold dread and a strange reluctant sympathy slid through her. What is happening? Land inspection, he muttered. They need proof I'm settled. Proof I have a family structure. Proof I'm not letting this place die. Another pounding knock. He nudged her toward the nearest bedroom. When he looked at her, the urgency changed, softening into something close to pleading. She saw the truth then. Fear, not manipulation, desperation, not deceit. "Please," he whispered. "They'll ruin me if you don't help." She didn't even have time to answer. He shut the bedroom door gently but firmly behind her. Through the thin wall, Vera heard the front door open and a heavy voice rumble inside. This voice belonged to a man who carried his authority like a badge. Slow, smug, comfortable. "Afternoon, Iron Horse. Where is the wife you claim to have? You said she'd arrive." "It's as I said," Gil replied, tension in every syllable. "Says here." The older man snorted. "You people have all sorts of stories when your land's on the line." Vera felt a pulse of anger for reasons she couldn't yet name. Then Gil called her name gently but firmly. "Come out, please." She stepped into the doorway. The older man's eyebrows shot up. He hadn't expected a wife. Still less a white woman with institute proper posture and a travel dress dusted in snow. Vera managed a steady smile. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm Jill's wife." The man's lips twitched, uncertainty trembling at the edges of his confidence. "Well, this complicates matters." He muttered something about damn brides and damn paperwork, then retreated sooner than expected. The moment the door closed behind him, Vera and Jill dropped their practiced smiles. She stepped back and he stepped away as though an invisible rope snapped between them. They stood in awkward silence until Vera finally said, "I believe we should talk." "Yes," Jill answered, exhaling for what seemed like the first time that day. "Yes, we should." And so the misunderstanding began to untangle slowly, strangely on a cold December afternoon in the far west, where the roan wagon had brought her to the right trouble, and maybe in time, to the right man. The explanation between them stretched longer than either expected. Vera, arms crossed tight over her coat, told Jill the whole chain of mishap, how she'd been reading reports, how she'd never seen his letters, how she was meant to meet her institute colleague at the station. Jill listened in a heavy silence, jaw working, eyes pinned to the floorboards as though the wood itself held answers. "So," she finished, "I'm not your bride." He never received any proposal of that sort. He stepped onto the wrong wagon. He rubbed the heel of his hand across his brow. "Then the real bride? She's not coming at all." "I am afraid not." A shadow passed across his expression. Disappointment mixed with a kind of resignation that felt older than he was. "Figures." He turned away, voice dropping low. "Sames folks only stick with an Apache when it doesn't cost them anything." Vera didn't know what to do with the ache that stirred in her chest at those words. She cleared her throat. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Iron Horse." He lifted his gaze then, meeting hers with quiet sincerity. "It's Jill a beat. And sorry doesn't change things with the land office." "What exactly is happening with your land?" she asked. He hesitated, then spoke as though unwrapping a wound. "They're trying to take it back, claiming I'm not using it proper, and I ain't keeping up with taxes, ain't producing enough. But none of that's true. The man you saw, he works for a ranch baron who wants the water spring on this property. They mean to push me out by any reason they can conjure." Vera frowned. "But what does a wife have to do with any of this? They want evidence this ranch has stability. A family structure means I get certain protections. Without that," he lifted one shoulder. They'd be on me like wolves." "So your bride," she murmured, "was supposed to be your proof?" "Yes." His voice didn't hold pride, only exhaustion. Before she could reply, a neighbor strolled past the porch window and called, "Gil. Heard your wife made it home. Congratulations." Vera and Jill froze. Both forced polite smiles and waved. When the neighbor moved along, the room fell back into its taut silence. Gil cleared his throat. "If you return to town now, they'll know. The whole inspection hinges on today." "I can't stay here pretending to be your wife," Vera said firmly. "It's absurd. I have my work. I need to reach the institute office." He followed her toward the doorway, worry sharpening his features. "Please, if you walk out now, they'll file the papers by sundown." "I'm not responsible for your misunderstandings," she snapped, irritation and confession tangling together. "I didn't agree to any of this." "No, but you stepped in when they asked." He said softened. "You helped. If you leave now, everything you did will unravel." Vera opened her mouth to argue again, but something tugged at her senses' faces. A sound, a restlessness. The cattle in the nearest pen were pacing in sheathless, heading bobbing, breath harsh in the cold air. A few thin cows nudged the fence rails as though unsettled. She frowned and stepped closer to the window. "Your cattle, they are distressed," Gil blinked. "Distressed. Agitated," she said, scanning their movements with the trained instinct of her profession. "They're not sick, they're anxious." He looked puzzled. "Animals get spooked sometimes. Coyotes, water, anything." "No," she murmured, eyes narrowing with focus. "This is patterned behavior. Chronic passy, heavy breathing, low milk yield. This is stress, not disease." He tilted his head, suddenly listening carefully. "How do you know?" "Because I studied it," she said, turning to face him fully. "It's part of the reason I came west. The Institute wants data on livestock behavior in harsh environments." He ran a hand across his jaw, an expression dawning hope. "Cautious but bright. You can tell what's wrong with my herd. I can try." Her voice steadied, switching into professional clarity. "But I'll need access to the animals, their feed, their watering cycles, your handling methods, everything." His breath left him in a visible cloud. "Then you'll stay. You need help." "Not under the claim of being your wife," she said quickly. He swallowed. "But they've already seen you," she hesitated. The cows loaded in the cold. A cold wind hissed through the barn slats. Something inside her duty. Curiosity. Maybe a touch of compassion shifted. "If I stay," she said slowly. "It's on one condition." Il straightened, bracing for hardship. "Name it." "I want authority over the livestock operations, feeding schedule, pasture rotation, stress management, shelter adjustments. If I'm going to fix this, I need control." For the first time since she'd met him, Jill let out a breath that sounded almost like laughter. "You want to run my ranch?" "No," she corrected. "I want to run the animals. And in exchange I'll continue the credence until the land inspection is complete." He nodded immediately, too quickly, almost gratefully. "Done. You agree without knowing what I'll change?" "Ma'am, if you can save that herd, you can change every rail fence I own." He held out his hand. She looked at his palm roughened from rope and dress. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth startle through her. "Temporary," she said. "Temporary," he echoed. Life arranged itself in peculiar patterns after that first uneasy pact. Vera took the bedroom. G took the battered armchair by the stove without a word of protein zest. In the morning she woke to the smell of eggs, biscuits, and strong coffee, a skill set she certainly did not possess. On the second morning, she attempted to repay him by cooking, producing a pan of burned lumps that might once have been eggs. He took one bite, then gently pried the fork from her hand. "Ma'am, please don't do that again." She bristled. "I'm not helpless." "No," he said mildly. "But the food is." Despite herself, she laughed a soft, surprised sound that made Jill look away too quickly. By day, she walked the pens with a clipboard, noting breathing patterns, pacing cycles, external stressors. She spoke in the language of data and observation. He followed in his quiet way, offering what he knew. Which cow had calved late, which hare spooked easiest, which steer had a habit of chewing fence posts when a storm threatened. Two worlds of knowledge began to braid together, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with unexpected harmony. One afternoon, while repairing a trough, Vera slipped on a patch of ice. He caught her by the elbow, steadying her before she could fall. For a brief second, they stood close to close, her breath mingling with his, the cold air brushing between them like a warning. She stepped back quickly. "Thank you," he nodded, clearing his throat. "Mind the ice. Winters mean out here." "Noted," she murmured. The days rolled on. Estrange, awkward, quietly warm. Not husband and wife, not strangers either, something in between. Something neither had words for yet. Winter deepened, snow thickened, and the two of them, thrown together by accident and desperation, learned to share a roof, a herd, and the first fragile threads of trust. Whether either of them admitted it or not, the ranch felt different now, less silent, less lonely, as though the walls themselves sensed something stirring, something waiting. December settled deeper over the basin. Nights grew longer, shadows thicker, and the wind that came off the ridges carried a bite that could peel the courage off a man's bones. Vera learned the rhythms of the ranch quickly, how the cold made the boards creak, how the lanterns guttered in the drafty hallway, how the animals stirred at the slightest disturbance. She also learned something else. Working a ranch wasn't just labor. It was listening. Every morning she and Jill moved through the pens like two mismatched halves of a single routine. She charted feeding cycles, the angles of the troughs, the temperature shifts between dawn and noon. He hauled hay, checked the fences, and mended whatever the wind decided to break overnight. They spoke less than they observed. Yet somehow they understood each other more with each passing day. One morning, as she stood outside the cattle pen, Vera closed her notebook and frowned at the pacing herd. "This pattern isn't random," she murmured. "It matches high-stress cycles I've seen in research, but the source isn't disease." He leaned against the top rail. "They pace worse some days than others." "Yes, and those days seem to line up with external disturbance." She hesitated. "Have you noticed anyone riding close to the property lines, yelling, firing shots?" Hill's jaw tightened. "Men from the land office or from the man who wants my spring. They ride by making noise trying to spook the herd, might think it's a fun way to pass time." "That's not mischief," she said sharply. "That's sabotage." He glanced at her, an ember of respect warming his eyes. "So that's your word for it?" "It's the correct word." She flipped open her notebook again. "Sabotage has measurable effects on livestock. Stress lowers milk yield, disrupts digestion, weakens immune response. This is intentional harm." Gil exhaled hard, a visible sigh in the cold. "Thought I was imagining things." "You weren't," she said. "Your instincts were right." He didn't respond. But his shoulders eased a fraction. As though being believed eased a weight he didn't want to name. They spent afternoons adjusting the shelter walls to soften the wind, adding cloth baffles, moving feeding stations away from loud gusts. Sometimes their hands brushed when they reached for the same tool. Sometimes they spoke over each other and then fell quiet, embarrassed. Sometimes Gil would watch her as she concentrated, her brow furrowed, lip caught between her teeth, and wonder how a woman this sharp, this determined, had ended up in his half-frozen corner of the world. One icy evening, they worked long past sundown repairing the goat shed. Vera held a lantern steady while Jill hammered a board back into place. "You know," he said carefully. "Most folks wouldn't last a week out here, let alone stay to help a stranger." "I don't see you as a stranger anymore," she said without thinking. Hill's hammer stopped mid-swing. She felt heat rise to her cheeks and quickly added, "I mean, your ranch, your work, I see it now. It's honest. It's worth understanding." He finished the nail and stepped back. "Wish more people thought that way." Something in his voice, a deep old loneliness, made her chest tighten. She almost placed a hand on his arm, but thought better of it. They walked back to the house without speaking, the lantern between them, casting two long silhouettes across the snow. The next night, Vera sat by the kitchen stove long after Jill had gone to bed in his armchair. She reviewed notes comparing milk yields to documented stress markers. Numbers danced across the paper, blurring as her eyes grew heavy. Her mind drifted to the cattle, their anxious pacing. The way their ears twitched at every sharp sound. Stress wasn't a theory anymore. She saw it living in their bodies. Suffering wasn't just physical. It was emotional, behavioral, environmental. A wave of frustration rose in her. So much damage done by careless men. She needed air. Pulling on her coat, she stepped outside into a crisp world of moonlit snow. The night was quiet except for the wind nudging the barn door on its hinges. As Vera wandered to the cattle pen and rested her arms on the top rail. "Poor things," she whispered. "No wonder you're scared." One of the cows lowed softly, a weary hollow sound. Vera didn't think she hummed, a tune her mother used to hum while mending clothes, gentle and low, a lullaby woven out of habit and love. The melody slipped through the cold like warm breath. The cow stopped pacing. Another long low hum trembled out of her. She sang words then quiet, almost shy. The animals settled, shifting their weight, lowering their heads. A few lay down. The pen fell into a calm she hadn't yet witnessed. She sat down against a post, exhaustion catching her at last. The cold bit through her coat, but her eyelids grew heavy. She leaned back, cleared throat, and sleep caught her before she could fight it. He found her an hour before dawn. Eddie stepped outside to check the horses and saw a strange shape by the cattle pit, soft, still curled in the snow. "Beta." His voice cracked. He crossed the ground in long strides. When he reached her, his breath stuttered. She was asleep, cheeks pink from cold, lashes frosted, but alive, breathing. "You stubborn woman," he murmured. "You freeze yourself to death one of these nights." He slipped his arms beneath her, lifting her gently. She stirred once, but it didn't wake, her head falling against his shoulder. For a moment, he stood there holding her, the cold forgotten. Something warm and fierce rose in his chest, protective, bewildering. Inside, he laid her carefully on the bed, pulled the quilt to her chin, and let his hand rest a moment on her hair before pulling away. When morning light crept through the curtains, Vera blinked awake. She was warm in her bed. That made no sense. "He fell asleep outside," she whispered. "Didn't he?" Before confusion settled deeper, Gil's voice echoed through the hallway. "Beta, get out here quick." She threw on a shawl and rushed outside, hair tangled, eyes puffy from sleep. He was kneeling beside a cow. A pail half full of fresh milk belonged them. "Look," he said, grinning for the first time since she'd known him. "They're calmer today. Milk's coming easy." Vera stared, astonished. It worked. She hurried to kneel beside him. "My theory, stress modulation, environmental soothing. It wasn't disease at all." Gil watched her as she explained, animated and brilliant, her hands fawning in excited gestures. His heart thudded once hard. She caught him staring. "What? Why are you looking at me like that?" Jill blinked, flustered. "Nothing. Just you're good at this." Her cheeks warmed. "Thank you." They worked side by side, hands brushing as they reached for the same teat, the same bucket handle. They laughed when one cow swatted them both with her tail, breath frosted in the air between them, close enough to mingle. For the first time, the ranch felt not like a place burdened by winter, but like a place where warmth could grow. Neither of them said it, but the shift had begun. The morning after the milk breakthrough, the world felt a shade lighter. Beta moved with a new spring in her step, scribbling notes as she walked through the yard. He followed with an almost boyish grin tucked into the corner of his mouth. Not obvious, but there if one looked long enough. It was the first time he'd seen real hope for the herd. But hope on a ranch was fragile. It didn't take long for trouble to sniff it out. By late afternoon, the wind had turned sharp and restless, rattling the barn slats. Beta stood beside the pasture fence, jotting down improved feeding times when she noticed the horses in the far paddock lift their heads in unease. A moment later, she heard what they sensed first hoof beats on frozen ground. He stepped out of the barn at the same time she did. His expression hardened. "That ain't good." Down the main road rode two men, one she recognized from the land office, the other a wiry fellow with a scar along his cheek. Both carried rifles across their saddles, though not pointed at anything in particular. Their horses clattered to a stop at the gate. The older man smirked. "Afternoon, Iron Horse." Heel rested a steady hand on the fence, though Vera could see a flicker of anger beneath the calm. "State your business." "Inspection date's been moved up," the man said. "My employer feels there's no point delaying. Your production numbers won't meet requirements come Christmas. We're starting the paperwork." "That's 4 days early," Vera said sharply. "You can't simply," the man interrupted. "Little lady, this is between landowners." "She is my wife," Jill said, voice low and taut. "Hearsay matters on this land." The man's eyes narrowed, flicking between them with a hint of suspicion. "Funny thing," he said slowly. "Some folks in town been mumbling that she ain't really your wife." Vera stiffened. A cold prickle crept down her spine. Heel stepped closer to her in a protective angle. "You making accusations you can't prove?" "I ain't making them," the man said. "Just hearing them." His companion chuckled under his breath. Heel's jaw worked. "State your actual business and leave." The older man shrugged. "Fine that. We return tomorrow with the formal order. Enjoy what's left of your land." They turned their horses without another word, kicking up snow as they rode off. As soon as they were gone, Vera released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Heel's shoulders sagged slightly. "They're pushing harder." "Means they're getting desperate." "It also means," Vera said, pressing her notebook to her chest, "that we don't have time to waste." They spent the next days preparing for the hearing like soldiers readying for battle. Vera transformed the kitchen table into a command center, papers spread wide, ink blotting cold white pages, graphs climbing and dipping like the Basin Hills. She mapped the exact correlation between stress events and milk decline, building a timeline so meticulous that even Gil seemed impressed. "You really think numbers on a page are going to sway them?" he asked one evening, watching her line up charts. "Numbers don't lie," she said. "And neither do observable patterns. They can dismiss you, but they cannot dismiss empirical evidence." He snorted softly. "They can try." "Then let them," she said, meeting his gaze. "We'll be ready." He held her eyes a moment longer than necessary. Something passed between them, unspoken, taut, and warm. Vera felt it like a spark in her ribs. She cleared her throat. "We should continue." He nodded quickly, looking away. "Yeah, right." Working side by side so closely every day wore down the invisible walls between them. One afternoon, Vera climbed onto a wooden crate to inspect the ventilation slats along the cattle shed. The crate wobbled dangerously. Heel, stacking firewood nearby, saw it tipping. "Careful," he barked. Before she could step down, the crate lurched, sending her forward. Heel was already there, catching her mid-fall, arms secure around her waist. Her hands clutched his shoulders. Their faces were inches apart. "I thank you," she breathed. His voice dipped, rough as old timber. "You keep falling into my arms like that. I'm going to start thinking it's on purpose." Her cheeks flushed. She opened her mouth to reply, but Gil sat her down gently, stepping back as if burned. "Let's fix the slats," he muttered. Vera nodded too quickly. "Yes, of course." But something had shifted again, quiet, undeniable. That night, the wind rose into a howl that shook the shutters. Vera lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling. The ranch had worked its way under her skin faster than she expected. And Gil was a quiet storm of steadiness and grief, of loyalty and a burden. She didn't know when she'd started watching the way he moved around the animals or the way he softened his voice when speaking to the calves. She rolled over. She shouldn't be thinking about him that way. They were not truly married. Their arrangement was temporary, professional. But then she remembered how his arms felt when he caught her. Her breath stilled for a moment. She sat up abruptly. Enough. She needed water. Crossing the hallway, she paused when she saw a dim glow through the sitting room doorway. He sat awake in the armchair, elbows on his knees, staring into the wood stove. Shadows flickered across his face, deepening the lines of fatigue. "You're awake, though?" she asked softly. He looked up. "Surprise. Couldn't sleep. Lot on my mind." Vera stepped closer. "Tomorrow will be rough. But we have evidence. They can't ignore that." He looked into the flames again. "Men like them don't fear evidence. They fear losing power." It paused. "And an Apache with land. That's something they'd rather not tolerate." Vera's heart tightened. She knelt beside his chair. "Then we stand together tomorrow. You won't face them alone." He turned to her, eyes dark and searching. "Why are you helping me like this?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, surprised by her own lack of an immediate answer. "Because," her voice lowered, "because I believe in what you are fighting for." Something warm flickered in his gaze. Something vulnerable. It looked as if he might reach for her, but then the wind rattled the window pane, snapping the moment apart. He leaned back, clearing his throat. "We should rest. Big day tomorrow." Vera pushed to her feet, her heart thumping. "Yes. Good night, Jill." "Good night, Vera." She walked back to her room, closing the door behind her with trembling fingers. She knew then tomorrow wasn't just a land fight. It was the day everything between them would begin to change or break it. The morning of the hearing dawned pale and cold, the sky the color of unblazing tin. Vera wrapped her scarf tighter as she stepped out onto the porch. He was already outside, hitching the team to the wagon. His breath rose in steady clouds. His face was unreadable. "You ready?" he asked. "As ready as we can be?" He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. The silence between them wasn't hostile, just heavy with worry. With unspoken fears, with everything yesterday's near confessions had stirred, they climbed onto the wagon, the boards creaking under their boots and set off toward town. It was a long, quiet ride. Vera tried to focus on her notes, but her hands kept trembling. She didn't know if it was the cold or nerves or something else entirely. Beside her, Jill kept his eyes forward, jaw tight. With every mile, he seemed to withdraw deeper into whatever thoughts were biting at him. When the wooden buildings of Silver Basin came into view, Vera exhaled shakily. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "we did everything we could." Gil didn't speak at first, then without looking at her, he murmured, "I'm glad you were here for it." She felt that like a touch. The hearing was held in the town hall, a squat, weather-beaten structure near the general store. Inside, a stove crackled half-heartedly, barely warming the drafty room. A long table had been set up with 3 officials sitting behind it. Among them was the heavy-set man from earlier, his expression smug as ever. A few townsfolk had wandered in to watch. Word of Gil's supposed marriage and his land troubles had spread quickly. Vera caught sight of Mrs. Pritchard, the school teacher, and old Mr. Carraway from the mill. They'd come perhaps out of curiosity, but Vera hoped, maybe naively, that some had come out of quiet solidarity. Gil remained standing beside her, shoulders squared, face stern, but she sensed the tightness beneath it. These land ancestors' heritage was more than survival. It was identity. One of the officials cleared his throat. "Gilito Norse, we're here to determine whether your property meets the requirements to remain under your ownership. We will review production numbers, stability of residence, and land usage." Gil nodded as Vera stepped forward before she could second-guess it herself. As Mr. Iron Horse's wife, a murmur rippled through the room. She pressed on. "And as a livestock specialist assigned to study ranching conditions, I'd like to present scientific evidence relevant to his case." The heavy-set man scoffed. "Scientific evidence isn't the issue. The issue is low production and poor management." "On paper, perhaps," Vera, clear's throat, said evenly, "but the paper does not show what we've documented." She opened her folder, laying out charts and graphs. "These are the herd's milk output patterns," clear's throat, "across the last 30 days. You noticed the declines occurred not due to illness, but due to stress. Stress caused by disturbances along the property line." The official frowned. "What disturbances?" Deliberate disturbances, she emphasized. Instances of loud noise, shouting, gunfire, and aggressive riding patterns by men tied to the land office. Each event correlates directly with a sharp drop in milk production. That caused a ripple of unease. Vera continued, her voice steady, measured. Stress is not guesswork. Stress is measurable. And when the environment was returned to calm, when the herd was treated gently, sheltered properly, they recovered. Milk output improved again within 24 hours. The heavy-set man glared at her. That's speculation. Vera met his gaze without flinching. He observed it firsthand, and so did the animals. They cannot falsify their reactions. Before the official could argue further, a voice rose from the back. He saw him. Old Mercy. Karobai called out. Men riding the fence at night, hooting and hollering like fools. Spoked my own mule clean through my garden once. And they did it on my side, though, MRS, Pritchard added. Face reigned with anger. My chickens didn't lay for those days after. More voices joined, neighbors testifying one after another. He looked stunned. He had never asked for help, never expected it. But here it was, unbidden, genuine. The officials exchanged uncertain glances after several minutes of tense murmuring among themselves. The panel finally addressed Gil. Mr. Iron Horse. The chairman said, given the evidence presented, both scientific and testimonial, we will postpone any decision to revoke your land rights. The board will review these findings thoroughly before issuing a final ruling. The heavy-set man bristled, but said nothing. Hill's jaw unclenched just slightly. Vera felt the breath she'd been holding escape in a thin, shaky stream. The official continued, a letter will be sent with the final decision. You may return home. Hill nodded. Thank you. It wasn't victory yet, but it wasn't defeat. Outside, the winter sun hung low, casting long shadows across the street. Gil helped Vera into the wagon, though she didn't need the help. His hand lingered a second longer than necessary before he withdrew it. Thank you, he said quietly. He only presented the facts, she replied, though her heart warmed at the sincerity in his voice. Facts don't stand without someone brave enough to speak them. Her breath caught. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then a wagon pulled up near them. A man stepped down tall wearing an institute coat. Vera stiffened instantly. Miss Langford, he called. There you are. The institute needs you back for presentation and review. They sent me to retrieve you. Hill's expression shuddered. She turned to him quickly. Hill, no need to explain, he said, voice too even. You got your work. This doesn't mean he climbed onto the wagon seat, hands tied on the reins. You should go. They're waiting for you. Her throat tightened painfully. Ella come back. His jaw flexed. Safe travels, Vera. The words were polite. To polite. A wall had risen again, one she hadn't meant to trigger, one built from old wounds and deeper fears. She stepped back as the institute man guided her toward the other wagon. He flicked the reins. His horses started forward. He didn't look back. Vera climbed into the institute wagon, heart pounding. As the distance widened between them, snow began to fall soft, steady, indifferent. She clasped her folder to her chest, whispering to herself, I will come back. But on that cold road out of Silver Basin, she wasn't sure if Gil believed that or if he ever would again. Hill's wagon creaked back into the valley late that afternoon. The air tasted metallic, the way it always did before deep snow, and the ranch sat quiet beneath the pale stretch of sky. So quiet. It fed the horses, checked the sheds, walked the fence line. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. Inside the house, her absence hung like a draft under every door. Vera's show wasn't on the hook. Her notebook wasn't on the table. Her humming, which had become part of the place, was gone. He sat heavily in the armchair that had been his bed for weeks. The cushion still held the faint scent of her lavender soap. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and stared into the cold wood stove. She's going back east, he muttered. That life makes sense for her. He told himself that again and again, but the ache wouldn't loosen. 3 days later, Christmas Eve, a rider from town galloped up the path. He stepped outside, wiping his hands on a rag. The rider handed him an envelope stamped with the seal of the land office. "Letter came early," the man said, "figured you'd want it before Christmas." He thanked him quietly and watched him ride off. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal. Snowflakes clung to the page as he unfolded it. "The board has determined that your land remains under your rightful ownership. Evidence presented was sufficient. The property shall not be revoked or transferred." He closed his eyes, breath shuddering out of him. Relief hit hard, not the triumphant kind, but the weary, grateful kind that made his knees weak. He sat down on the porch step, letting the snow fall around him. They kept the land. He'd kept his family's place. But the one person who helped him when it wasn't here to share the moment. He didn't realize he was smiling and hurting at the same time. Miles away in a worn but impersonal meeting hall, Vera stood beside her institute supervisor as he praised her presentation. Her findings on emotional stress in livestock were hailed as innovative and potentially transformative for frontier ranching. A new project awaited her, one that required extended research in the West. "You'll be returning to field sites next month," her supervisor said, handing her a stack of forms, "preferably to a ranch already familiar with your methods." But Vera wasn't listening anymore. Her mind replayed Gil's expression when she left, the guarded hurt in his eyes, the way he swallowed whatever he didn't dare say aloud. He thought she'd abandoned him. She realized with a twist of her heart that she couldn't stand the thought of him believing that. The decision came easier than she expected. Waiting the hour, Vera packed her trunk back onto the institute wagon and asked the driver to take her to Silver Basin. Not tomorrow, not next week, but tonight. Snow fell heavily as they traveled, muffling the world. She kept glancing out the window, breath fogging the glass. She wondered if he'd be awake, if he'd be angry, if he'd even want to see her. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling. He was bringing in firewood when he heard the crunch of wheels in fresh snow. At first, he thought it was a neighbor coming to congratulate him. But then he saw her. Vera stepped down from the wagon slowly, her coat white with snow, her hair wind-tossed, her cheeks flushed with cold and nerves. She clutched her satchel like a lifeline. He froze in place, the firewood slipping from his arms into the snow. She swallowed hard. He came back. He stared at her as though she might vanish if he blinked. "Thought you were going east for good." "I thought so, though," she said softly. "But the institute wants me to continue my work here. They want me stationed at a ranch that understands the research." She lifted her chin slightly. "Your ranch. If you'll have me." He took a step toward her, then another. "Vera." His voice cracked in the cold. "Why do you really come back?" She hesitated. Snow drifted around them like falling ash. "For the work," she began, then stopped. That wasn't the whole truth. Not anymore. She met his eyes. "And because leaving felt wrong, because I kept thinking about the animals, about the land." Her voice softened further. "About you?" Something in Gil unraveled. Something wound tight for years. It closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "You sure?" He murmured. "You ain't here out of duty." She shook her head, snowflakes shaking loose from her hair. "Not duty." She exhaled. A eyelid, breath trembling. "Choice." Gil didn't kiss her. Not yet. But he reached for her hand, curling his fingers around hers with a gentleness that startled them both. "Then stay," he whispered. "Not as my pretend wife. Not because of the land office. Stay the way you want." Her eyes glistened. "I want to." He finally smiled. Slow, warm, unmistakable. "Then we'll build something real this time." That night, Christmas night, the ranch glowed with lamplight. The cattle rested peacefully in their pens. The stove crackled in the kitchen. Outside, snow glimmered like powdered silver. Gil and Vera stood on the porch, shoulder to shoulder, watching the quiet land they had fought for. "Feels different this time," she said. He'll navid. Feels like a beginning. She leaned lightly into him. It is. He slipped an arm around her, not urgently, just naturally, as though he'd been waiting for the world to allow it. And as snow fell soft and steady over the basin, the two stood together, partners, equals. No charade between them anymore. Ready to shape a shared life forged by hardship, held by choice, carried by a hope neither of them had expected to find. The ranch no longer felt lonely. It felt like home.